Welcome back to another episode of The Radio Psychs, your premier podcast for insights into everything mental health. I'm Dr. Aaron Haddock.
And I'm Dr. Rhonda Yu. We're psychologists who care about people and bringing science to practice.
And we're so glad to have you join us.
Please note that the information shared in this episode is solely intended for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Today's episode is on moral disengagement.
We've all had those moments where we think, how do they live with themselves? Whether it's a corrupt politician, a shady corporate exec, or even an internet troll stirring up hate.
Exactly. We see it all the time, whether in real life or on TV. Take Breaking Bad's Walter White. He doesn't start as a villain, but little by little, he justifies all kinds of terrible actions. In his mind, it's all for his family, like the ends somehow justify the means.
And when we encounter situations like this in real life, I think we all wonder, how did they end up there?
Yeah, like, are they really just unethical, or did they find some way to justify their actions to the point where it felt acceptable?
So when it comes to justifying actions that clash with our values, a process called moral disengagement helps explain what's going on.
Right. As we grow up, we learn and adopt standards of right and wrong, which act as our internal guide. So when we behave in accordance with those values, it feels rewarding and boosts our self-worth.
But when we go against them, it can trigger feelings of guilt or self-contempt. Moral disengagement is basically a way to mentally sidestep that guilt or shame we normally feel for doing something we know is wrong.
The theory was developed by psychologist Albert Bandura, who built on earlier concepts in psychology to identify a set of mental strategies people use to disconnect from their own moral compass. Why don't we break these down?
Yeah, let's go. One of the big ones we've already touched on is moral justification. This is when we convince ourselves that an unethical action is serving a greater good or higher purpose.
It's the classic the end justifies the means argument. People use this to make something wrong seem like it's not only necessary, but maybe even the right thing to do.
Next up is euphemistic labeling. This involves using sanitized language to make unethical behavior sound less severe, like referring to civilian casualties as collateral damage, for example.
Or companies might call massive layoffs right-sizing or streamlining operations.
Yeah. It sounds less harsh than firing hundreds of people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Then there's what's called advantageous comparison. This is when people compare their actions to something much worse, making their behavior seem minor in comparison.
Like saying, sure, I cheated on my taxes, but at least I don't run a drug cartel.
Okay. Another strategy is displacement of responsibility, which is when people deflect blame onto authority figures or the system. Like saying, I was just following orders. I'm not the one to blame.
Closely related is diffusion of responsibility. This happens when responsibility is spread out among many people, so no single individual feels accountable.
Yeah, for example, in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of Wall Street folks would justify risky financial decisions saying, IBG, YBG. In other words, when the negative fallout of what we're doing finally hits, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Moved on to other jobs or positions.
Okay. Disregarding or distorting consequences is another one. Here, people minimize or ignore the harmful outcomes of their actions. Think of industries that downplay the environmental damage they cause, insisting it's not that bad or that nature will recover.
Then we have dehumanization, where people talk about or view their victims as less than human. History is filled with tragic examples, from slavery to genocides, where entire groups were dehumanized to justify atrocities.
Finally, there's attribution of blame. This is when the perpetrator blames the victim or circumstances for their own actions. It's like saying, it's their fault for being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Okay, those are the mechanisms. Now let's talk about how they work.
Essentially, these mental moves enable us to bypass the emotional discomfort that typically comes with acting against our moral standards. It sort of creates a mental buffer that helps us deal with the cognitive dissonance we feel.
Take moral justification, for example. By framing harmful actions as serving a greater good, we can convince ourselves that we're still upholding our moral values, even when we're not.
Euphemistic labeling works in a similar way. By changing the language we use to describe our actions, we can distance ourselves from the reality of what we're doing. It makes it easier to live with ourselves because the words don't carry the same emotional weight.
Take cyberbullying. Online, people often feel a sense of anonymity and diffuse responsibility. And when this is coupled with dehumanization, seeing the target as just a username rather than a real person, it makes it easier to say things you'd never say face to face.
So, I think it's clear how moral disengagement can make people lose touch with their own ethical standards and lead to serious injustices and harms. But how does that play out in terms of mental health? Can it affect someone's well-being?
Absolutely. Even when someone convinces themselves their actions are justified, the internal conflict doesn't just disappear. That cognitive dissonance can create a lot of stress and anxiety as you try to reconcile the two.
Right. And even if moral disengagement helps someone temporarily justify actions, those feelings of guilt and shame can resurface, especially when they're faced with the consequences. That can really impact their mental health, leading to feelings of depression or self-loathing.
And over time, our choices catch up with us. The regret and realization of the harm caused to others and to yourself can cause social isolation and trigger feelings of self-contempt and shame, which can lead to depression.
But the good news is that by understanding these mechanisms, we can work to counteract these tendencies in ourselves and others. What's the first step?
It's really awareness. By understanding the mechanisms, we can start to recognize when we or others are using them.
For example, if you find yourself justifying a questionable action by thinking it serves a greater good, take a moment to reflect. Are you genuinely acting for a higher purpose, or are you just rationalizing?
It's also important to be mindful of the language we use. Euphemistic labeling can be subtle but powerful. Pay attention to how actions are described.
And also how people are being described. Dehumanizing language is one of the most common and dangerous forms of moral disengagement. Red flags should go off any time you hear folks describing people as less than human.
Yeah, or referring to groups of people as something like animals, parasites, or swarms. And Roddy, empathy plays an important role too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. By fostering empathy and encouraging people to see others as fully human with their own experiences and feelings, we can counteract this tendency.
Here, engaging in activities that promote perspective taking and understanding can be very effective. I personally like to watch documentaries to immerse myself in lives and circumstances that are different from my own.
I'll add that on an individual level, regular self-reflection is key. We often get so caught up in our busy lives that we forget to take time to reflect on our actions and decisions and ask ourselves if we're staying true to our values.
And let's not forget the importance of education. The research is clear. Social emotional learning programs foster empathy and help students be better prepared to successfully navigate moral dilemmas.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the moral maze.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the Radio Psychs on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review.
If you have any questions or topics you'd like for us to cover in future episodes, feel free to reach out. We love hearing from our listeners and value your input.
Thanks for tuning in. Take care and be well, everybody.
Take care and be well.